Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be able to welcome you all on the behalf of Cooperativa platform and Cursiv, that is Cultur.hr, the co-organizers of this panel called From Bad to Worse, Research on the Impact of the COVID-19 Pandemic on the Cultural Sector in the Region. The panel is a part of the Regional Action Lab, Independent Culture as Engine of Mutual Support and Exchange in Times of Crisis project, supported by the Balkan Trust for Democracy, and the Regional Lab, New Cultural Spaces and Networks as drivers of an innovative and sustainable bottom-up development of regional collaboration project, co-founded by the European Union Creative Europe program. Given our topic, it is somewhat appropriate that I'm in fact addressing you from my room because I'm in self-isolation with COVID-like symptoms for the last couple of days. But I do have to apologize for not being very informed. I'm not actually going to bother you with the general story of the pandemic and the cultural sector because kind of the everyday reality of this situation is unfortunately all too familiar to you all. What we are interested here are kind of the detailed close-ups of our crisis that will provide, among other things, specific ammunition for advocacy in terms of relief measures and cultural policy. Luckily, we have a really wonderful lineup of speakers who will give us this invaluable insight into their organization's research relating to our topic. And for me, it is always kind of a source of an encouragement to be able to discuss these otherwise not very optimistic topics within this type of a little temporary Yugoslavia, such as the one that we've managed to gather here. So not to take up much more valuable time from our participants, I will shortly introduce everybody and then we can proceed with our questions. Just a note on the questions and comments, if anybody wants to ask, at any point, you can post your questions on the Cooperativa Facebook profile under the live stream. So our participants, first in alphabetical order, Predrag Svetičanin, PhD, teaches sociology and culture and arts and aesthetics at the Faculty of Arts, University of Niš, as well as cultural policy and cultural rights at the UNESCO chair at the University of Arts in Belgrade. He is also a director of the Independent Research Institute, the Center for Empirical Cultural Studies of Southeast Europe. His research interests are related to the emerging class structure in South European societies, fields of cultural production, cultural participation, and the relationship between social and cultural stratification in the Southeast Europe. Sanja Horić is a theater and film producer born in 1984 in Tuzla, Bosnia and Herzegovina. She earned a degree at the Academy of Dramatic Arts in Tuzla, Department of Production. She is currently attending the master studies at the Academy, majoring in theater and film production, and she has more than 15 years of experience in film production. For the last 10 years, she has been engaged in the association Front Slobode as the head of the multimedia archive and documentary production. She also conducts the entire production of the Workers' University platform and the Earth, Water, Air platform. She is an author of many short feature and documentary films. Next, we have Granit Karadzizi, who studied sociology at the University of Pristina. Granit is focused on cultural studies, specifically on cinema and music. In 2018, he co-founded the NGO ARTA. He held the positions of executive director and researcher until 2019, and since 2020, he works as a researcher at Anibar. So far, he has conducted a number of research projects, among which are A Brief History of Cinema, Yusuf Gervala, and The Situation with Culture in Peja, Public Perception. Recently, he conducted research on the situation of cultural organizations in the municipality of Peja, and the main purpose of this research was to understand in detail the challenges and problems faced by cultural NGOs in Peja. Luka Piškorić from Slovenia is a co-founder and managing director of Polygon Creative Center. With over 25 years of experience in the cultural and creative sectors, he works internationally as an expert focusing on bottom-up development, creative and cultural hubs, audience development, and new economic models. Luka is a member of the Council at Cultural Policy Designers Network and member of the Board of Directors of European Creative Hubs Network. Jaka Primorac. She's a senior research associate at the Department for Culture and Communication at the Institute for Development and International Relations in Zagreb. She holds a PhD in sociology from the Zagreb Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. Her research interests intersect the fields of sociology and culture, sociology of media and communications, and sociology of work. Her work is centered on the relationship between culture and economy, with the particular focus on cultural and creative labor issues and implications for cultural and media policies. And last but not least, Tiana Spasovska is an art historian and cultural activist working as a program and administrative coordinator for the Jadro Association of the independent cultural scene in North Macedonia. She is one of the organizers of Krik Festival for Critical Culture held in Skopje. So, dear people, for the first round, I would simply like to ask you to give us a basic introduction to your research and an outline of the most important conclusions regarding the impact of the pandemic on the cultural sector in your local context, with special emphasis on the independent cultural scene. And we can start maybe with you, Predrag. Thank you.
Lujo, since I have some data, I'll prepare a short presentation.
Okay, thank you.
I hope it will be visible.
It is, yes.
Okay, our research was a regional one. We did it at the beginning of pandemic from May to July 2020. And it was called, it's now only more evident now, the life and work of cultural workers during pandemic caused by coronavirus. We had 554 participants from Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Slovenia. We tried to do survey also in Kosovo and Albania, but there were no enough participants. We didn't include them in the research, and we use online survey questionnaire consisted of 44 items. At the end, there were two questions in which we asked respondents about positive and negative effects of the crisis caused by COVID-19. There were three basic goals. First, we want to document the working and living condition of cultural workers in Southeast Europe at the period while the pandemic was unfolding. Then to see whether there are any mechanisms which were of assistance to cultural workers during this period, and try to see what will be the tendencies or an outcome of the crisis which will affect the life and creativity of cultural workers in these societies. And the obvious first effect was financial. I will speak mostly about Serbia, and other colleagues will speak about other countries. So what was clear in first 2 months of the pandemic, that their income halved. So for example, in Serbia, average income of participants was about 500 euros. But then in March, it was 247. In April, it was 264. In April, it was 247, and it started to decline further. And you can see for other countries as well, that if the income was, for example, for Croatia, over 1,000 euros, then in March, it was, in April, excuse me, it was 650. In May, it was 552, and so on. So we asked them also to estimate what would be the loss for the period of 2020. And their estimate was between 3,000 and 5,000 euros. For Slovenia, 8,000 euros, which is basically the half of their income for the country. But what was particularly worrisome is that for some of these participants, they were not able in these few first months to earn anything. So for example, in Serbia, there were like half of 40% of participants who in the first month, in April, earned less than 100 euro. And in May, it was even more than when there was this shock. So, and there was an additional survey that we did. There were several organizations included. In these first 3 months, there were many events or projects which were simply canceled because people didn't know what to do. So for example, 80% of artistic events in public space were canceled in March and April. And then 60% of all art workshops, educational programs, and international projects. What was even more dangerous for these people, they were earning nothing. but at the same time, only few of them had savings. Like 1/3 had no savings whatsoever. 1/3 had savings in the amount of 1,000 euros. Only 1/4 had savings more than 1.5. And at the same time, they had bank loans, which they had to pay. Later on, it was a bit, they regulated this, they postponed payment of the bank loan, so it was better. And in addition to these financial effects, we identified several other negative effects of the crisis. Problems related to artistic works, to negative impact on mental and physical health of the respondents, and broader negative social and political effects. When it comes to artistic works, mostly it was related to people who are part of performance arts. It was different for those dealing with visual arts or multimedia and so on. Those in performance arts, they were claiming that they cannot work without the audience, with no contact. It's impossible to work from home. They're getting out of shape. For example, ballet dancers, they are saying that it will take months for them to recover and to get into shape again. Then many of them reported psychological problems, but they were mostly not speaking about being afraid of illness itself. They spoke about an anxiety, uncertainty, stress, and so on. And also they realized that the public perceives them as voracious consumers of city budgets, that these are the people which are not contributing something to social life, but basically they took the money which is necessary for other things. And for numerous cultural workers, negative effects were also related to broader social and political effects, like dissolution of democratic traditions and violation of human rights, censorship of media, further dissolution of welfare state, and so on. And we identified several strategies, one may say, how they dealt with it. 1/3 of respondents, they had financially more stable occupations, so this is how they survived. Another 1/5 of them procure alternative sources of income, but unfortunately there were 2 groups which were thinking of changing the profession at the time, and one group which decided to leave the country. They said that we had it, that's it. We don't want to continue. So I will stop here and let the others speak, and I will join in the discussion later.
Okay, Predrag, thank you very much for this concise and clear and frankly very distressing account of the situation in Serbia. Maybe it would be logical to continue with Jaka, because Jaka was like an associate on this part of the research that was dealing with Croatia. So Jaka, if you can maybe now present your overview.
Yes, hi, thank you again for inviting me to participate in this roundtable. As it has been already noted, I was one of the participants in the research project that colleagues at Tichanin led last year during May to July. And I'll here in my kind of intervention concentrate on these results for Croatia, but also I will also speak some more about the results from this other project that I've been participating in on the resilience of Croatian society, because this research has data on civil society organizations, which is one of the main focus here in this round table. Croatian case, this has to be highlighted, is special because, of course, the 2 earthquakes that occurred during the pandemic, one in Zagreb and the surroundings, and the other in Sisak, Moslavina County in December the same year. And this also has contributed to further deepening of the crisis that the pandemic has actually done. As considering the first research project, as in other research countries in the region, in Croatia, in the same period, cultural workers noted a significant drop of income. They expressed an expected decrease in total earnings and continued trend of the necessity of additional work and self-exploiting practices in their working and daily lives. In the research countries, as Peja already noted, measures for minimizing the negative impact of the pandemic in the cultural sector were mainly done on the national level, and they were not adopted and created on the local level. This has been the case in Croatia as well, where only a limited amount of measures on the local level were adopted, taking into account that the local level of funding in Croatia is an important stream of funding. This also proved to be problematic for the cultural field in general. Just for illustration, the local level public funding for culture is 38.6% of the total public funding, in which the city of Zagreb funds represent a significant share. But overall, it has to be noted that the state level remains the most important public funding source, and the public funding in general is the most important stream of funding, as private funding remains rather limited and is based mainly on selected sponsorship and in-kind support. Our research dealt with the first wave of pandemic, and during that time, the measures on the national level predominantly included one-time assistance to artists and cultural workers, and they include selected indirect measures like postponement of execution of programs, etc. And during the following period, during the 2020, the measures on the national level changed in their form, value, and scope. There has been pressure from the cultural sector itself to change some of the measures, to introduce some other ones. And 3 different packages of measures have been adopted until July 2021. They diverged from compensation measures, calls for digital adjustment programs, concert programs, calls for normalization activities, covering the cost of COVID testing for cultural organizations that actually do the program. But one of the biggest measures that was made was for loans to cultural and creative industries. So we can say that our research showed that for cultural sector in Southeastern Europe and in Croatia as well, the first wave of COVID pandemic has brought a number of negative consequences, as Peja also stressed. While these early measures in most of the countries were of limited impact and scope, but what we observed kind of on the positive side positive effects were in the strengthening of the solidarity within the sector and greater networking among cultural workers, as well as in the strengthening of the view that kind of a new, more sustainable approach to the cultural sector is needed. When focusing on the independent cultural sector, as the title of the roundtable suggests, the problems that have occurred during the pandemic, as our first research showed, but this other research that I'm participating in also highlights, and this is the research on the social resilience of Croatian society in the midst and aftermath. We were very optimistic when writing up this project application and the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is led by Dr. Branko Ančić from the Institute of Social Research in Zagreb. It showed that the pandemic is only amplifying the already existing situation that was there before the pandemic. The results of our qualitative part of this research dedicated to the state of civil society organizations during the pandemic showed that the COVID pandemic changed the framework of laboring in the civil society sector in general. There is limited space for topics that are outside of the scope of the pandemic. The right to gather and work with users is limited, and the working conditions of civil society organizations that provide various social, educational, and advocacy services have changed. And in the cultural sector in particular, the structural differences between the public, private, and civil society sector in culture that were before were basically a blueprint for the different impact of negative consequences of the pandemic on the working conditions of cultural workers and artists. As the civil society organizations in the contemporary art and culture, even in pre-pandemic times, worked in a more fragile circumstances than other sectors, this fact was amplified by the pandemic, or as one of our participants in the research noted in the interview, it has stripped to the bone the situation that was there before. And the data from this research also show that the crisis is perceived as a natural state, as a state of permanent shock that is taken as a given for the independent nature working in these organizations, and how during the years the civil society organizations have been sensitized to get by through different types of crises, which shows their resilience. However, the crisis caused by the pandemic and the earthquake in the Croatian case has actually deepened the existing problems of civil society organizations in general and cultural sector in particular. And the results of our research show the trap of this flexibility and resilience due to neoliberal projectification of the sector. And crisis has been used as an excuse for further marginalization of the civil society sector, especially its advocacy role. And all this opens the question of the limits of this resilience of civil society organizations. What kind of resilience are we actually talking about? If it is built on taking crisis as a natural state that is based on getting by and on the self-exploitation of cultural workers. So with this basically question, I will stop here and give floor to other colleagues. So thank you for attention.
No, thank you, Jakov. This was a very, very, very useful insight into both of your research. There's a lot of extremely important topics that you opened up. We're going to return to that in the later parts of the conversation. Granit, maybe it would be really so much interesting to hear your part now, because as Predrag said, the research of the Center for Empirical Cultural Studies of Southeast Europe did not manage to gather enough data to show, for example, the state of affairs in Kosovo. So we'll be really interested now to hear your experience and the results of your work.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. What we did is that we only had our research was localized only in the municipality of Peja. So what we did is that we tried to see the challenges and problems of the cultural NGOs in our municipality. But what we did is that we tried to gather two types of data. For example, to see the challenges before the pandemic, the challenges that they had after the pandemic. So in order to do so, we have combined methodologies like qualitative and quantitative data. In qualitative data, we had a focus group with organizations cultural organizations that are part of the network of the cultural independent scene in municipality of Pea. And we had some interviews with directors of Directorate of Culture and Youth and Sports. In the first data that we tried to, besides the focus group, we had a questionnaire that we sent to these organizations. In the focus group, firstly, we identified the first challenges and problems that organizations have. So we identified some of those that are not related directly to the pandemic. For example, lack of human resources, infrastructure and logistic problems, source of fundings, and the effect of pandemic in these challenges they already have before the pandemic. And the questionnaires, then within the questionnaires, we try to measure these challenges in the organizations that they have. For example, for the human resources, like 28% of the organizations that were interviewed said that they had no person employed as a regular staff, and the entire organization operates with a voluntary basis. And that gives we have other, for example, for infrastructure and logistical part, for example, 28% of the organizations said that they do not have any offices. And that we try to understand, to see if this correlates with a situation with a pandemic, but as pandemic, it didn't have any effects in these two parts of the organizations, because as a problem, it existed before. So it was only a continuity of these organizations to not have volunteers and to not have staff and to not have offices. Another in infrastructure, another data that we got, it is that 57% of the organizations do not have a specific space when they realize they artistic and cultural activities in that they already have. But when we try to see the impact of the COVID-19 in the sources of funding, we saw that most of the impact was at the public subventions that they give to the organizations, and it didn't have much effect on the international funds that they got from international organizations. So that might be a correlation between that because during the pandemic, none of the organizations lose their staff or something like that, and that might be a correlation because most of the projects they paid the staffs from the international funds that they have. But it was a big pandemic, had a big impact on the public subventions. For example, in the municipality of Pea, they cut all of the funds that they had for culture because they wanted to redestinate those funds to other parts of the municipality. And that was one of the main problems because they didn't have any emergency funds that were spread to other parts of society, but none of those were shared to the NGOs. but the most impact of the COVID-19 in the municipality of Peja were felt in cultural activities. For 76 of the organizations that were part of the research that municipality had that COVID-19 had a big impact on the activities. 36 of them were 36% of them were totally cancelled, and 36% of them were postponed. Only 25% of these activities were transferred online, and with transferring online, these activities created a new challenges for the organizations, because in that conditions, they didn't have money to get extra staff, so they had to retrain the staff in order to face the new challenges that are related to the digital part. So these are mostly the problems and the challenges that we dealt. But in conclusion, not the pandemic didn't have any big impact on the staff, but mostly had impact on the public fund from municipality and in their activities.
No, thank you very much, Granit. It's really important to have you here present this data, because usually, at least from my experience, we don't communicate enough and don't have much insight, as much as we should, into what's going on in Peja and in the Kosovo context. Another context that, from my experience, we lack a bit of communication with is maybe Bosnia and Herzegovina, as strange as that may seem. So I would very much like to hear now from Sanja about her work and the results of her research.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. Thank you for inviting me. Although I come from a little bit different, background, because I'm not majorly professional in the research about cultural production and stuff. I mostly work on generally reporting on workers' rights. So, as I said, in my organization, we mainly work on reporting and documenting and archiving workers' struggles, workers' movements, generally disenfranchised workers, mostly in my canton, but also in Bosnia and region. So last year, when the pandemic started, we as the NGO faced the problem of not the funding, but the implementing activities that we already had funds for. So instead of having a meetings one-on-one with workers that we usually do, or making gatherings or group works with workers, we had to find another way to implement our activities. So first trigger for us for this research about position of the worker in pandemic was actually the moment when one Bosnian well-known newspaper fired about 20 journalists without any explanation, just saying like it's pandemic and we don't know what's going to happen. Some of these journalists were also our associates, so we decided to relocate some of our funds and to pay these journalists to investigate about the position of the workers, generally workers in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we got a really good picture of how did the workers meet the pandemic. Most of them were fired, as I said before. Everything was like in a mist. So at one point I wanted to take a peek at what's going on in the cultural sector, because nobody usually talks about it, and it's not the thing that is in a focus in it, at least in my canton. So I spoke with the director of the National Theatre in Tuzla, which is my colleague from Academy. I was wondering how they are going to handle everything during the pandemic. This research took place from March to May last year, so it's a bit out of date. As he said, like, it's not a problem with the institutions because luckily in Bosnia and Herzegovina, most of the cultural institutions are getting funds from the government. So the main problem are these, let's say, external artists that are engaged in the projects from time to time. So when pandemic started, eventually if they don't play, they won't get any salary. So that was the main problem. And we focused our research in that direction. What's going on with the independent artists in Tuzla, my hometown? What are they going to do in this period? Because we really didn't know how long will this take. And as the colleagues before mentioned, each of the countries in our region had some kind of early measures how to support the artists. In Bosnia, we didn't have anything. I can surely say that in Bosnia, culture and arts are really not good or privileged positions. So it seems also like we don't really need either culture or arts. So government in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, with the rebalance of the budget for 2020, abolished all funds for associations and organizations in culture. Moreover, they also shortened a lot of funds for even cultural institution in federations. Most of the associations condemned these decisions because a lot of independent artists are working exactly in these organizations or independent institutions. So it opened a really new, let's say, cloud of problems in Bosnia on how to treat an independent sector. I think it's good to say that even in Bosnia, freelancers or of any kind are totally not recognized, even by our government. Even our prime minister doesn't actually know what a freelancer is. For him, it's like some kind of satellite that appears and reappears, do something and disappears. Like, so I don't know how to put this. As I said, most of the cultural institutions didn't have to worry about the funds because with pandemic or without pandemic, they will get some funds from the government. The only problems are the small people, independent artists that doesn't have like any fixed or long-term contracts. And as one of the actors that I did an interview with last year, he said like it's not easy to say in Bosnia that you're independent artist because it means that you live without any payment, you live with your parents and you're waiting for them to give you some money. So that's a good picture of the independent artist in Bosnia. So as I said, most of the institutions didn't have to worry about the funds, but most of them also had to find a way how to continue their activities, how to keep the good communication with the public. So most of the institutions, both formal or informal, everybody moved their activities online as it was trend in most of the countries in the world. Some of the theaters were releasing recordings of the theater plays online on platforms. Most of the artists try to find some new ways of earning money. So one of the photographers tried to make new short videos in the nature that would be published online, and he was expecting to earn some money because he was really desperate in that way. Some institutions really had good programs online, such as public library in Zenica. They organized the poetry marathon on World Poetry Day on March 21st. They gathered over 100 videos with reciting poetry, both by professional performers and amateurs, as well as poetry lovers. And considering this really good and great success that they had last year, they decided to keep this format in the future. Some of the institutions tried with producing new video or multimedia materials that were published online. But for me, everything that was done, it seems like, I don't know, some kind of a desperate call for, for attention, because everybody knew that we will just have fun online and we will get nothing more out of it. So from everything that I said, freelancers, independent artists were in a big trouble when pandemic started, even though they were in the same, almost same trouble even before pandemic. So it really raised the question of law, generally law that treats artists in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So after the pandemic, after the last year, and during these years, just some of the efforts to change law on a federal level were made. So I would also stop here, and perhaps we can later discuss about this law that would finally recognize an independent artist in Bosnia and perhaps give him or her some kind of help.
No, absolutely. This question is also kind of important in Croatia too. This attempt to define the independent artist, excuse me, in this new legal framework. So we can return to that absolutely. Thank you very much for introducing us to this kind of particularly complex context of in a kind of formally complicated context of Bosnia and Herzegovina. You mentioned the problem with the rebalance of the budget. That is also something that unfortunately was bad news from Slovenia recently. So I would kind of use this as the opportunity to turn to Luka to give us, like Polygon, who did like a really detailed multi-layered research, and we would be very happy to hear his perspective, their perspective on the state of affairs in Slovenia. So Luka, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Lujo. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, Slovenia is facing in the last 2 years with two disasters. One of them is, of course, COVID, about which we are talking today, and one super closely connected is our right-wing government that took office exactly at the same time as COVID started. So we will come to that a little bit later. Also, our research is kind of touching upon this topic. I will quickly share a short presentation that I made about our research. Let me just do it full screen. A second. Up. No. It's taking some time. So I will try to be very brief, although I could talk about this quite a lot. First of all, let me tell you that I'm today replacing here Eva Matjaš, who is the mastermind behind and main researcher behind this research that has been done also together with Polona Černić and Deja Kosi. am more in the role of the project manager. And of course, a very important part of our team is Maruša Račić, who did as a designer all the visualizations in our reports. It is also important to note that this research has been conducted in co-production of Polygon with the Center of Creativity at the Museum of Architecture and Design in Ljubljana, which is financed from the European Cohesion Funds. So luckily, we were able to get funding for, although not adequate one, but enough that we could conduct this research. So our research really focuses on the impact of COVID pandemic on the life and work of the workers, Slovenian workers in the culture and creative sectors. So it's kind of quite broad in this sense. We did our first survey already in April 2020 and published our first report in June 2020. We did our second survey last autumn, and the third one this spring. Report came out in September. They are all available on our website. Unfortunately, they are in Slovene, but summaries are in English, but I guess you could understand quite some out of it. So in September, we also did workshops with stakeholders and prepared the final report for these last 2 years in November 2021, which I will be also kind of presenting in this short presentation. We are also planning our fourth survey next spring. It is important to know that with each survey, we are kind of correcting small mistakes from the previous surveys, adding more questions, and really kind of developing this research with each new survey. I must say that we were quite lucky with gaining a very good sample, altogether 3,000, almost 3,500 respondents, which is 10% of all the population employed in the cultural and creative sectors in Slovenia. We have focused on all the different types of employment in these sectors, from student work to self-employed to actually also people who are employed in NGOs and companies, also public institutions. So this kind of covers all these different types. And also we were covering all the subfields, from performing arts all the way to service design, crafts, photography, and so on. Yeah, here are the key kind of findings from our final report. But I must really stress again, this is only kind of top of the iceberg, since through all these free surveys, we were really able to gather a lot of insights that are presented in our reports, especially through a lot of open questions, which was also quite a surprise for us, how many responses we also got on the open questions. Basically, almost 60% of all the workers in the creative and cultural sectors are self-employed. And this was also one of the questions in the survey is, we found out that actually almost a quarter of them works alone compared to others who collaborate with others, because this was the question, with how many people do you actually collaborate? So this is also quite interesting insight. Also, what kind of came out is that more than 74% of all the workers work in at least 2 subfields of culture and creative sectors. In more kind of detailed reports for specific subfields, we can see that people also work in more than 2 subfields. A lot of them also in other fields that are totally unrelated to the cultural and creative sectors in order to be able to survive. Our research also shows that most of the workers are based in the city, and almost 65% in Ljubljana, concerning Slovenia. 33% work from home, and 11.3% actually cannot afford the workspace, which is one thing that we have been already trying to address as Polygon, as Creative Center, prior to the pandemic. 53% have a monthly income that is below the Slovenian average, which is 1,200 euros net. And if you take a look at the household income, 48% have less than 2,000 euros. We have been also asking them about their situation concerning their home if they own a flat, if they are renting out, how their landlords responded in the first months of crisis. Would they kind of be helpful in kind of lowering the rent, or even kind of giving some kind of moratorium on it? And yeah, from this data, we can kind of conclude that 42% of all the workers are not actually homeowners, and 74% are actually in a relationship, which is also super relevant if we want to kind of talk about these survivor strategies. What I also wanted to stress is that 34% didn't receive adequate government help. And what also, of course, very much scares us is that 42% of all the workers are actually thinking about leaving the sector. This is very worrying, and of course, a lot of them already did. From our experience from the field and from what we are kind of seeing on a daily basis, we can already see that certain professions are already lacking professionals. For example, sound engineers almost abandoned the field, and now, of course, with the rise of video conferencing, online kind of conferences, these productions are already struggling to get adequate professionals to work on that. And 51% can make a living, only 51% can make a living of their profession, which is also super worrying. And concerning to the relationship with the state, already mentioned before, 67.8% do not receive public funding. Almost 50% didn't receive any government support whatsoever, mostly due to their precarious status and position, and only 10% of the workers are actually employed in public institutions. Here it's also important to stress that, of course, our government really seized the opportunity of the COVID pandemic, not just not to help, of course, the stakeholders in the creative and cultural sector, but to actually kind of strategically try to destroy it, not only by ignoring the adequate help, but for example, for ridiculously prolonging the measures that resulted in cultural institutions being closed to the very kind of last, as the last ones. Everything else opened before the cultural institutions. So this is kind of super tragic. This summaries are also available in our report for subfields from graphic design, musical sector, architects, and so on, which are also kind of interesting insights that you can see. And one thing that we also did is also to see how different generations were impacted by the pandemic. So we have kind of divided them, the ones who were born after 1991, the ones who were born between 1982 to 1990 and are kind of were most impacted by the 2008-2010 so-called recession, and so on and so on. So here you can also see quite some very interesting insights that I really won't go into much detail at this point. But I would really like to invite you all to our website where all these reports are available. Especially this final report is also available in English, and also we have a complete article summing everything up that is also available in English, because we are really trying to kind of share our knowledge also beyond our borders. So this would be kind of like very shortly from my side, and more in the discussion I hope I can contribute.
No, Luca, thank you. No, we will definitely even share the link directly here, because it's really a wonderful way to present this information, this wonderful attempt to make it communicate easily with the public. So it's a really fantastic example of the way to present insight into this really difficult situation. Thank you. And to conclude, I would like to ask Tiana now to present her organization's research into the situation in North Macedonia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Well, I did not conclude any of the surveys I will mention, but my organization did. So I'm here in the name of Jadro to share some of our experience. And unfortunately, after all this quite of negative stories, I also cannot share anything more positive. The situation in North Macedonia is quite similar with the rest of the countries. Well, first of all, I would like to mention the investigation, the survey that was concluded in from 13th of March 2020 until the 8th of April. It was part of the regional investigation, the one that the previous speakers were talking about. And our numbers are set as the previous one. For example, I could share that 130 answered, we gathered. In our case, it was interesting that 56% of the answers were coming from people who were in the music industry or music field, which for us, it was quite of interesting that the musicians were kind of first to engage and to react, because this was in the beginning of the pandemic. Well, 26 of the answers were coming from the visual artist and 22 from interdisciplinary sector. What was also interesting, it was that the 51% of them were unemployed, which is a very sad situation. And I think that this is not a result to COVID, but to the general precarious condition in which the cultural workers in Macedonia were and still are, and I don't know for how long we will be. Only 23.8% of them were employed, and the rest stated that were self-employed as an independent artist or temporary employed, which is generally sad. Also, some of the questions, I will not go through all of them, but some of the very interesting numbers we get were that 89% of the participants answered that the COVID measures have negative impact on their work, from which followed a lot of events to be canceled in the beginning of the COVID. Of course, this changed. I will tell you how later, but they were really afraid because they lost income. And I will just read some of the questions that we asked and some of the numbers. I'm just sorry just to find them. Yeah, so 83% of them said that they have experienced some kind of financial loss in the beginning, which is a huge number. And 53.1% of them answered that they have lost all their finances in the beginning, which is just tragic. I don't know. I don't have any other words to explain the situation. So we also had some questions which were asking like whether other people are affected by this loss of finances, like with families and with relatives. So 66% of the of the participants answered that their family will feel this loss, this financial loss. And yeah, so it's not only that the cultural workers were affected, but their relatives, their families, and this pandemic had a kind of wider effect on the general situation, not the, I mean, through the culture, but it has a wider impact. And often authorities, they're not consider this, that the people who are working in culture, they have families and they also contribute in the other parts of the societies that we are very often put on the margins and kind of forgotten. And another thing that I would like to share with you, which is more recent, I cannot go in details because this survey that we did is not officially published yet. It was open until the 5th of December this year, so it's very recent and very new. We have the answers. We questioned organizations and individuals separately. So because I'm not an author, I will not reveal too much, but I considered some of the answers as very important and crucial for the discussions we are having right now. For example, we asked 26 organizations from independent cultural scene whether their activities grew or decreased in the last 3 years, the number of their activities, the programs. And the answers were kind of interesting because they actually realized more and more activities each year, more and more projects. But when we asked them about their financial situation, whether their finances grew or they also decreased, they also answered that their finances decreased. So what does this tell us about the precarious condition? Like the independent culture scene is producing more and more projects and programs and activities because we were first to adapt, we had to in order to survive. But on the other side, the financial opportunities for us are less and less. So the bad financial situation is even worse. I will not go into details regarding the second survey, which I forgot to share the title. It was actually mapping and analyzing the economic and social position of the cultural workers and artists in the country. And very soon we will have this survey published. So I invite you to go and check on our social medias. Probably before the end of this year, we will have it published. And I also want to to express my gratitude to all people in Jadro who went through this research and who gave their efforts, so all of us will have better picture about the bad conditions. I mean, we all knew that the conditions were bad, but now we kind of have precise numbers, and now we can discuss this on another level with authorities, municipalities, and everybody. Thank you. I will not take any more time.
Well, thank you, Tiana. Thank you so much. That was kind of the thing that I thought about saying just after hearing your talk. We all have indeed this kind of general idea of what the situation is, at least in our context, but to hear about this specific research that you all did and the specific results and like the exact numbers of like percentages of interviewees that are left without any income and similar data, that's this really that's simply invaluable to all of us, especially from this kind of when we get this regional perspective, and important obviously for any kind of advocacy and fighting for workers' rights in the cultural sector. So thank you all so much for this overview. It was incredibly important and useful. We've touched upon the emergency measures a bit in your talks, but maybe I would like to kind of really focus on this issue. So for the next round, I would like to ask you, how would you rate the emergency measures implemented on the national, local levels in your own contexts? And what types of measures would you recommend, at least in the short and the midterm, to help the cultural sector? And maybe roughly, I know it's a kind of a really difficult general question, but roughly what changes do you perceive as necessary in the long term to establish cultural policies that would make the sector safer and more sustainable? Because we always have this kind of, this topic of the sector being vulnerable as it is, even without the pandemic. Maybe we can now start with Jaka, because Jaka, you spoke a bit about the emergency measures, so maybe you can start this round.
Okay. Yes. Well, I mean, it's always difficult, kind of to speak about the assessment of the measures that are actually already still kind of ongoing, and kind of to envisage what would be kind of the best case scenarios. And it is always kind of difficult to think in the shoes kind of a policymaker, of a policy advisor, and also kind of taking into account maybe the unwanted actions of the policy measures. But kind of I would maybe start from kind of a more general comment, and more kind of what would help kind of in the long term, and then maybe something what are already present practices that are available in the short term, mid-term, and short term, that I see kind of as important in this context, and in the context of Croatia. I think that maybe as one of the problems that actually stem not only, I mean, for the whole cultural sector, not only for the independent cultural sector, is basically the low status of culture in Croatian society. And I dare say that is the question in the region of Southeast Europe as well. I mean, how to change this would need action on several levels, and as these have been processes that have been going on slowly in the last decades. But maybe kind of as one of the first actions that could be taken on the policy level to show the orientation towards stressing that the culture is important, would maybe be to increase the public funding for culture, which should go above 1% of GDP per capita. And according to the data for public cultural expenditure in Croatia in 2019, it amounted to 0.79% of GDP per capita. Although this is an increase from 2014, when it amounted to 0.68. And there have been comments and from the Ministry of Culture itself that, taking into account the EU funding for culture, the level of public cultural expenditure rose to 0.99%. But this is not sustainable. This is project-based. This depends on the project that are developed and done. And so I think that maybe kind of to show the orientation towards bettering of the situation in general in the future, maybe this could be done, the increase of the GDP per capita in general. And I think it's kind of interesting, and maybe as an inspiration also, probably most of you already know one of the actions of the Culture Action Europe that is also relevant for this context, was the awareness raising campaign of the culture in the EU's national recovery and resilience plans. it was there lobbying for 2% for culture in these plans. In Croatia, this total budget, this amounted to 1.2% of the national budget for national recovery and resilience plans, which is basically oriented to two streams, to the competitiveness, transformation, and strengthening of culture and creative industries. And the other is the establishment of media fact-checking systems and systems of data public disclosure. So this is kind of the orientation in the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. So I see there's not much of independent cultural sector here. And the interventions outside of this cultural envelope are basically for the energy renovation of buildings with the cultural value. I mean, of course, it is not the increase of the funding would rectify the situation, because a lot of different models need to be changed in the policy making orientation. But I think one of the problematic parts is the project-to-project type of approach that is dominant in the cultural and creative industries and in the independent cultural sector, as the model that kind of needs to be overcome, especially taking into account the small scale range of a lot of projects we already talked about, that these organizations need to apply, usually in direct competition with each other and with other organizations that they could and should cooperate with. I mean, Croatia is a very small country, and a lot of the regional countries as well, and with small resources. And I think that more cooperation needs to be encouraged rather than competition for these really restricted resources. And I think, as looking at the midterm kind of solutions, I think that a more orientation towards these longer program schemes for organizations need to be developed. In Croatia, there similar programs are already present, for example, with Foundation Kultura Nova and National Foundation for Civil Society organizations, but are only available for selected number of organizations, and usually cultural organization cannot get larger funds. So I think this kind of midterm strategy needs to be developed. But what I also think, and there has been some action already on this part in Croatia from the platform for bread, Zakruh, is basically that the public funding for honoraria for cultural workers and artists should be recognized as a designated cost on a project, because I mean, basically there is no other source where this could be found. And basically that we need to kind of think of remuneration of the work of artists and culture workers to recognize that culture work is work which needs to be paid, and it is kind of somehow lost throughout the years. And what I found really interesting during the pandemic in Croatia, that some of the associations and some of the artists that never spoke about artist work as work themselves have started actually in doing so. Some of the kind of really popular singers were advocating, we are workers, our work needs to be paid. So I think that was very kind of maybe a good thing of the pandemic, of rethinking of and actually just saying these things were important. And maybe just kind of a short term kind of solution maybe would be more availability of more stipends for artists in different fields, on which I think could also rectify the situation. So these are kind of just some of my ideas, and I hope that that I managed to give ideas, at least, or there's some inspiration for some. Yes, thank you for
Oh, no, absolutely. You raised a lot of crucial questions, especially regarding the project financing of the independent culture. So this is something that we all feel, and like the competitive model, this is a, a permanent problem of our field. So it's important to discuss that question, obviously. Predrag, maybe from your perspective,
Yes,
with
I
emphasis on the
also
Serbian.
I prepared a short presentation for the second part, if this is okay.
Sure, of course.
So about the mechanisms of assistance for cultural workers in society of South Serbia, I mentioned that research was regional, and I will just briefly say for Serbia what were the measures, and then try to see what are the lessons learned for the whole region. So for Serbia, measures were mostly delayed and partial. They included only freelancers who are connected into these national organizations of freelancers, and they give in June, meaning only almost 1 year after the pandemic started, like 750 euros to more than 2,000 cultural workers with freelance status, and then additional 500 euros in June 2021. And most of these local open calls were canceled, and the most difficult problem was that the open call for Belgrade, which has a huge funds for artists, was canceled in 2020. And in general, Serbian government chose like a shotgun strategy in relation to the COVID pandemic. Basically, instead of focusing on devastated sectors of economy like transport, catering industry, tourism, or culture, they were just giving money to everyone, which is very akin to vote buying, basically. They give in June 2020 100 euros to more than 6 million citizens, which is 620 million euros. And they kept giving this money 20, 30, 50 to different categories of population, those who need this support and those who don't need the support. So basically in these 2 years, they give almost 1 billion euros, but to individuals, and I don't see any effects, for example, on culture, on people who are hungry and have nothing to eat because they receive this 100 euro from time to time. When it comes to lessons learned, and I think this is the key thing, on the most general level, what Corona crisis shows that definitely there are some sectors which cannot be part of economic logic. For example, healthcare, education, and culture, if you make them into if you try to make them into profitable activities, it has disastrous consequences. There is a reason why Italy went worse in this first period, because the number of beds in public hospitals decreased 10 times in the last 10 years. So there are certain things that you cannot deal with private practices, and this was the case. So definitely it's clear that education, healthcare, and culture cannot be part of neoliberal scheme. Then the second thing, when it comes to finances, several colleagues mentioned that. If you look at the data for Serbia, you can see that basically the same amount of data, and especially the same percentage of data, is given to cultural institutions and to all other actors. Never mind whether these institutions are working or not. So in 2019, they were receiving 95% of the budget, and in 2021, they received 95% of the budget, which means that basically it's a ridiculous way of handling cultural policy. And you can see here in the data in the third column that all civic sector actors in 2020, 2021, in 2020, they received 1% of the budget for culture, and 2021, 2%. And the final row that all of these members of the independent cultural scene of Serbia, it's an association of more than 80 organizations, they receive 0.14 or 0.17 parts of the fund. So it's a ridiculous situation, which definitely has to be changed. And our research was called Now It Is Only More Visible. And this is what many of our colleagues were saying. This is not something which started with Corona. This is something which really made the situation completely clear. So what is basically needed? more funds for open calls, for programs and projects. If you just give funds to secure institutions in existence, it's a ridiculous cultural policy. So you need more funds from of course, you cannot give 90% to programs and projects, but you can give 10%, and it will make a radical change in terms of cultural workers. Then if cultural practice is moved online, then cultural policy has to respect this. Cultural policy has to include more online activities, support for online activities, etc. Then it's clear that it won't last for a short period of time. I mean, now we are already in the second year. So this one-time financial assistance, this is something definitely which is not sufficient. What is needed is continuous financial support in terms of institutional grants for organizations and continuous social assistance for a broader circle of cultural workers, not just those employed in cultural institutions or freelancers. For example, I would tell you about the fund, Solidarity Fund of Association of Independent Cultural Scene and other organizations. Basically, it turned out that more than 3,000 people were not covered with the measures of the government. And there are multiplicity of other forms of support for organizations and cultural workers, which can be included. In the table, you can see some of the things that we collected during the research, the things that were done in certain countries. So for most of them, one-time financial assistance for artists and cultural workers, but then payout of funds for approved projects with the permission to realize them when it is possible. Then extension of deadline for realization of approved projects. New open calls for projects which will be realized after pandemic is over. New calls for projects will be realized online, and different types of indirect measures like right for social assistance and unemployment compensation during the pandemic, moratorium of loan payments, exemption from payment of taxes, delay of tax payments, lowering the price of workspace during the pandemics. So there are many ways that you can help if you want to. As our colleague from Slovenia mentioned, in some cases, governments use this situation to crack down independent cultural scene. And this will be counterproductive. And what is evident also, what is the lesson learned, and which is, I think, really important, the pandemic clearly indicated the importance of professional solidarity. And it was clear in Serbia and the other parts of the region when I did the research for Serbia, Association of Independent Cultural Scene of Serbia, and 7 other networks and associations. We organized Solidarity Fund of Cultural Workers in Serbia very early on when it was clear that some people won't survive the first wave of the crisis. So we collected like 50,000 euros. It is in this ocean of needs, this is nothing, but people were giving small amounts, organizations were giving bigger amounts, and there were 1,668 people who applied for the fund, and we gave like 200 of them. We supported them, but what is also very important, for the first time there is a front of several major organizations and artistic associations which together require some things from the government. And I think that it's ridiculous to say that solidarity funds and these things will solve the situation, but these fronts are really important because they have to pressure governments to do something and showing them that this is not just for the benefit of these people, although it's important for them to survive, it's important for these societies. If you want to do something, try to do systemic measures, because otherwise this cultural sector will simply die out, and this is not something which is good for the society. Thanks.
No, thank you, Predrag, for this kind of ending with this note of solidarity. One really cannot emphasize enough the importance of the solidarity, not only of cultural workers, but cultural workers, and not only on the national level, but on the regional level. You mentioned the Slovenian context. I know, Luka, that it's not very easy to think about, the propositions for emergency measures in the current situation in Slovenia. But we'll be happy to hear about your ideas and what you think about how to intervene and maybe aid the cultural sector in this situation.
As mentioned before, yes, like 63% of our respondents in the survey actually think that government measures were inadequate, and another 23% recognize them as barely adequate. So 34% didn't even get any support whatsoever. So our only hope, of course, is change of government, that we would finally have government stakeholders who would be prepared to sit by the table and talk about what we can do, what kind of measures can be implemented. Hope for that is in April 2022, when this means next spring, when Slovenia will have new parliamentary elections. So we'll see about that. Also, there has been like a considerable damage done to the sector, because government is destroying the image of the sector, portraying cultural workers as parasites and so on and so on. So a lot of work will have to be invested into kind of re-establish the image of culture in Slovenia, and of course also the value that the cultural and creative sectors bring to the society and to the economy, on the other hand, and of course how this can also help in the recovery of, or in the transformation of economy and society after COVID passes. Slovenia has implemented very interesting mechanism of support for the tourist sector, which was, of course, beside the cultural sector, most hit. It was these vouchers. So every citizen of full age actually received a voucher for 200 euros last year that could be spent for tourist kind of, infrastructure, hotels, and so on and so on. And of course, this year, it was a pressure that the same voucher would be also introduced for the culture kind of services. So when government introduced another voucher this year for 100 euros for full of age citizens, it was for tourism and culture at the same time. But this means like tourism, accommodation, and so on, these kind of services. Also, it could be spent in restaurants, of course, which also kind of narrows down the opportunity for people to spend it on culture. And of course, for culture, it could be spent, but of course, it was quite limited to organizations and public institutions who are registered actually properly to be for culture. So you have, for example, I don't know, gallery, which is basically maybe registered officially as artist association, and could not, for example, take these kind of vouchers. So this was kind of a bizarre kind of turn of events. No, I must say that I was happy that I could turn in my voucher for the tickets to the Laibach concert. So I did support with my voucher. But what I wanted to say is the role of the public institutions. I think it's very important here, because public institutions already before COVID were kind of, basically employing 70%, some of them, of self-employed people. They were collaborating on a very regular basis. And of course, these people found themselves in a very, very horrible situation with the COVID and all the restrictions. And when public institutions were forced to close, cultural institutions we're talking about. So what we expect is that public institutions take better care of their collaborators who are basically self-employed, that they pay them fairly, do not do dumping on the market, and of course that they also pay for exhibition fees. For example, in Slovenia, for example, if you are as an NGO applying for funds, you have to give exhibition fees, while public institutions are not obliged to do that, and of course in most of the cases don't do that. So this is one hand. On another hand, I see opportunity in cross-sectorial collaborations. In the last year, I have been working a lot in the field of digitalization of cultural heritage, because a lot of funds, also European funds, are being now channeled into digitalization of cultural heritage. So here we see a lot of opportunities also for other fields like audiovisual sector, architects, photographers, and so on, to actually collaborate on these projects of digitalization of cultural heritage. And I must say, in Slovenia, we have quite some very good projects run by public institutions that do offer opportunities also for the other stakeholders from the cultural and creative sector to participate in these processes. Slovenian government also made interesting proposal during the Slovenian EU presidency, which is happening now. So in October, they proposed some kind of European Netflix concept. We'll see about that. But of course, this is a very, very important aspect, because we have to ask ourselves is how also the COVID pandemic impacted the audiences, how their ways of enjoying and consuming culture have changed during the pandemic. Of course, in the hard times, of course, everyone went online. It was, but of course, did these NGOs or public institutions have this kind of audience? I don't think so. They are now struggling to build it for their online kind of activities. But we have to understand that, of course, people, the majority of the people can be also portrayed maybe as lazy. And of course, it's the easiest to click on Netflix or HBO and get instant gratification through this kind of online platforms that don't bring much to the table, to the local kind of creatives and creators and artists and so on. So this is very important, that we try to support new ways of reaching audience, especially in these times of crisis, and of course in their changed habits of consuming the culture. What we also perceive as very important is to continue with everything that we have been doing already before, addressing all the issues that were already much pressing before the COVID. And this is soft skills development of the cultural and creative workers, which we saw that are very, very much needed and are, of course, resulting very well of course, in empowering them and offering them affordable workspaces, because this is the huge problem in Slovenia with this extreme gentrification that, for example, Ljubljana has faced in the recent years, with this extreme neoliberal touristification of Ljubljana, where everything went Airbnb and so on and so on. So artists are working from their bedrooms, you know, it's horrible. So this is also a very important aspect of providing affordable workspace. A lot of course, NGOs and artists were evicted during the COVID times, and they were even struggling to get the how do you say, storage space for their artworks. And this was horrible to see. And of course, it didn't help that municipality of Ljubljana destroyed autonomous center Rok, which housed more than 600 artists and so on, and threw them out in the middle of the lockdown, and destroyed their artworks while evicting them and so on and so on. So it is very, very important from my point of view, this aspect of community building. We have seen this, and this has been already mentioned, solidarity in the sector and so on and so on. But we have to work more on this, especially also that people recognize of being in the same sector together, because sometimes architects don't see themselves in the same sector as designers, and so on and so on. Although, for example, visual artists many times also work in the design fields and so on and so on. So we have to work on this community building. And of course, I see a great potential in unionization, building a syndicates, and giving, of course, power to these stakeholders, to the workers through these points, through this kind of channel. And yes, as mentioned before, we can only pray for a new government that would be actually interested into dialogue, into developing. But of course, very importantly, also collaboration among us in the Balkans and of course in the whole European context through various projects, exchange of experience, and I really see that this is super important.
No, it is, of course, and the question of unionization is something that's luckily a bit kind of starting to heat up in these spaces. So I think that's a very good sign, or it's definitely a sign of us being like pushed to the wall, to the extreme limits, and hopefully that's going to be one of the better developments as a reaction to this entire situation. And obviously, we are all keeping fingers crossed for the next elections. I think we'll all breathe like a huge sigh of relief if the thing changes for the better. Thank you, Luca. We can now move to Sanja, maybe especially in this context of unionization and this general question of worker solidarity. I think this is something that you will
Yes,
pick
this
up
is
on.
something that I'm trying to do for last at least 5 years. Because as I mentioned before, we are really working a lot with the workers, with the trade unions, and that is something that could be really a good potential even in this cultural sector. If we, first, I can say that I have nothing to say about measures taken in Bosnia, just to hop back, because I cannot grade something that didn't happen, you know. But in some short or mid terms, for the beginning, it would be great if we could at least have some kind of database of all the independent artists or cultural workers. That is something that's really missing in Bosnia. There are a couple of associations that are in a way representatives of some cultural sectors, but it's only on a level of an organization. We cannot speak about like a representation of all, I don't know, entity or Bosnia. So for the beginning, it would be great if we had some kind of record of all the people that work in culture and are not in any position of decision making. On the long term, as I mentioned before, there is labor laws in Bosnia are really complicated because, for example, freelancers are not recognized in any way. Freelancing is not recognized as doing a business on any level. So for the beginning, it would be great if our governments or governors consider that part of doing a business as any other. On the other hand, if we're speaking about the laws related to contributions, for example, each month on my work there would be at least 3 or 4 taxes paid for my contracts, and I can get nothing in return, you know, because I'm not recognized as self-employed. That is something that doesn't exist in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So for the beginning, it would be also great to have this recognition in the laws. On the other hand, we can speak about cultural workers. They are recognized by the law, but not in a good manner, because if you're speaking about workers in cultures by Bosnian laws, they have there is no difference between that worker or any other. So there is not any kind of privilege or I don't know, different treatment of the subject that they do. So it would be also great. The main problem in Bosnia is that every canton is deciding on their own laws. So even in that part, it is not unified. So even if in Tuzla Canton we make a great situation and laws for all independent sector, it doesn't still it wouldn't still be good enough for somebody who lives in 9 other cantons, so, or in Republika Srpska. So it's really complicated on so many levels. So just to repeat, for the beginning, it would be great to have a database of all the independent workers. Then we can talk about making changes in the laws that deals with the cultural sector, and trade unionism, definitely. That's something that hopefully could be like productive in Bosnia, but also in all region. That's it.
Oh, sure. And this kind of institutional overview in terms of databases and similar, similar things, it's something that's kind of it is kind of lacking actually. And the research that you all did are so valuable from the perspective of the fact that in a lot of contexts there isn't no continuous effort on the part of institutions to conduct this kind of overview and work.
And if I may add also, if you make some kind of the body that would make this how to say database or something, it would also be like really tricky who would be the part of that body, who would decide who can be an independent artist or get some kind of help. So in that part, it would be also be like really problematic to find a legitimate, how to say, body of representatives who would work for real, not for someone else's chances or opportunities, or for their own parties.
No, of course, and the question of defining independent artists and using what criteria is a kind of very complex and significant one. We could use an entire discussion just to talk about that and the way we defined and decide who deserves, to have that status. Maybe we can turn to Granit. Granit, you're speaking from a specific position because you did research on a local level, but if you have suggestions, maybe on a wider scale or either on the level of PEA regarding measures, we would like to hear that. Granit, are you with us? I'm afraid we can't hear you.
Is there?
Yeah, no, it's okay. Yeah.
All of the measures that were taken, the culture is not a list of priorities for the development of the country in Kosovo. That's why we didn't have a lot of measures that were taken for culture. Only when the government changed in the last 2 or 3 months, we had some measures that were taken for the culture, but most of them were canceled or postponed. So I don't know how to rate these measures that we already taken, because most of them were canceled. As for in local level, I think that it is really important to create independent budget for independent cultural scene, because most of the budget of the municipality or the main government goes for the institutions that they're already part of the minister or the municipality, but there are only a few budget that goes for the independent scene. So at this moment, it needs to be created independent budget for the independent cultural scene. And what is important is that because from the research that I conducted, I've seen that more than 50% of the organizations, they work in suitable spaces. So I think it is important to reallocate the budget, not only to give budget only for the activities that is happening, but to go for investments in infrastructure and logistical stuff. That's it for.
Yes, of course. The question of infrastructure is kind of fundamental and is related to a lot of stuff that we were talking about, including the privatization and gentrification and a lot of these other subjects. So it is kind of obviously the central point and needs to be addressed. Thank you, Granit. And Tiana, if we can hear you, experiences from North Macedonia.
Hi, can you hear me, see me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I will not go in details about the general situation, how our government dealt with measures regarding everybody or regarding culture, but I will try to mention some attempts of a measure regarding the independent culture sector, which is something that I'm personally concerned. Well, the ministry in particular did not have any good, let's say, measures or general. They had two open calls, let's say, for the independent artists. And the first one was they received coupons that they could spend in the shops, in the grocery shops or stuff like that. And the second one was a financial measure that there were like three categories regarding their previous income. So based on their previous income, they will fit in a category and get some kind of financial support. Also, the government had an open call for a foundation and organization in general, but this was not particularly meant for independent culture or culture. So of course we were kind of in the sea, in the big sea with all the fishes, and culture is not the strong, the foundations and organizations in culture are never priority when we are talking about the general non-governmental sector. Also, the local municipalities have their own measures, but that's really on a municipal level. For example, the city of Skopje, the municipality of Skopje, in the beginning of the corona, that they had an open call for a project. I don't know how they were, how they built this, but it was called Corona during pandemic. And they organized series of events with independent cultural organizations or artists, and they received some kind of, as far as I could find online, they received some kind of support of 250 euros per performance, let's say, which is not really a serious measure if we take into account the whole situation. So I would like to say more about what we are trying to achieve besides the pandemic, because the condition we are right now, it's not really just the result of the pandemic, as my previous colleagues mentioned already. It's the general the change of the politics, unstable local and regional situation. So we were fighting and we were raising the question for infrastructural support, because in Macedonia there is not a specific institution or specific calls which are dealing with infrastructural support for organization, which is crucial for us, so we can be employed, so we can have healthcare, we can have social security, and etc. So this is what Jadro was fighting for all these years. And some of my colleagues were really loud regarding this need, that we need to have this kind of support, because in the end of the day, we managed to find money for activities. But it's very hard to find money for the people who are organized that activities, because very often we cannot. For example, the Ministry of Culture does not allow the honorarium to get in your payment if you're employed. So you cannot actually be paid from the projects you're working in case you're employed in the organization. And this is very conflict situation of conflict. And yeah, this is one of our biggest topics. Another thing is support for multi-annual grants, because for now, all of our local financial supports are just for one financial year, fiscal year. And this is not very good when you're talking about planning of your activities and of it's not really easy to be sustainable and to kind of grow, because very often the European calls who are lasting for 2 or 3 years are not really matching our local calls, which are referring to only one fiscal year, and then we are kind of struggling. So this is not only a problem regarding the pandemic. This problem existed before the pandemic, and I will not even mention our previous situation with the far right government and how much the independent cultural sector suffered during that long period. So yeah, our suggestions are infrastructural support and multi-annual grants that will save us from the COVID and for the general precarious situation we are in. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tiana. I was just wondering now, while you were speaking, is the situation a bit better now? Because the first Minister of Culture in North Macedonia after the change of government was somebody from the tied to the independent scene, and then he got that he was had to go away from his position. What's the situation now?
Well, after the change of the government, it is better. I mean, a bit, but it's not better as we expected to be. Of course, it never is. During that time, as far as I know, there was a lot of independent cultural workers were part of the writing of the new law, because it's the last official announcement from our government regarding this new law. It is in June 2019. So we had this. We have this process of writing a new law that will solve a lot of these positions which are newly arose in the culture, but are not part of the old law, and it will solve some of the problems. But the law is stuck between readings, and there are a lot of amendments, and there are no official statement from the government what is going on with it. As far as we asked, we could not receive official statement. Yeah, with the new minister, this kind of things changed a bit, moved from some kind of very dead end. But since then, we had almost every year we have a change of minister, and it's very hard for each of them to really realize any kind of action plan, because they're changing in 11 months, in 12 months, 13 months. And we had some problems with some of the recent ministers spent more of his yearly budget. So when the new minister came, they were already in budgetary deficit. So it was not only the corona, it was bad management. and quick changes of politics, even though the general political situation haven't changed so far. And yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah, we moved from this dead end, but we haven't achieved what we were hoping for.
Yes, it seemed encouraging when Robert Talajozowski was his name with him, but then it unfortunately he had to go away. So and I didn't kind of follow, what happened afterwards. But yeah, thank you for the update.
No problem.
Sorry to hear, but it sounds like a constant complication. We've taken up a lot of time, so we have to wrap up soon. We just have one question, as far as I can see in the chat, to Predrag. Is the research or some parts of it available online?
At the moment we are doing interviews, because the data that we collected, it was at the beginning of the crisis. So we would like to sort of wrap up to see what the situation looks like to artists right now. We did 32 interviews in Serbia. Hopefully at the beginning of the year, there will be interviews done in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, and Macedonia. And then we will definitely publish a report, maybe even a book.
No, I think we are all really waiting anxiously for you to finish it and to be able to read it, because the work you're doing is amazing. We've been lucky enough to be able to read Jaka's report on Croatia, but it's really so important, and yeah, we can't wait for it to be published. We have to wrap up now. It was really very, very nice to hear you all and to hear the data that you've collected and your impressions on the measures. As for our part, I think I'm not overstepping my boundaries, but as somebody who comes from an organization that has some kind of a media infrastructure, I think we can offer all of you not only our solidarity, but us as some a contact or somebody that you can always get in touch with if you have research results to share, or if you need any kind of not practical solidarity in terms of support. Thank you all so very much for this amazingly informative and important talk. Thank you for participating, and hopefully we'll continue these discussions sometime soon. And thank you to all the viewers on the live stream, on the Facebook stream. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.